Dzień dobry Państwu. Witamy bardzo serdecznie na konferencji prasowej.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the press conference after the meeting of the Monetary Policy Council. Today we have Professor Adam Glapiński, Governor of the National Bank of Poland, and members of the Monetary Policy Council, Professor Rafasura, Professor Gartner. Please, the floor is yours. Information after the meeting of the Monetary Policy Council. The Council decided to keep the NBP interest rates unchanged, reference rate at 1.5%, lombard rate at 2.5%, deposit rate at 0.5%, and rediscount rate at 1.75. Incoming data suggests that global growth continues at a relatively slow pace, amid heightened uncertainty about the global economic outlook in the coming quarters. At the same time, sentiment in industry is still weak, with more upbeat signs coming from the service sector. In the euro area, despite higher quarterly GDP growth, the pace of economic activity growth remains relatively low. In the United States, economic conditions remain strong, and a quarterly GDP growth in Q1 of 2019 was higher than in the previous quarter. In China, GDP growth stabilized in the first quarter of this year, albeit recent data suggests the risk of a weakening in economic conditions in the current quarter. Oil prices have declined following a significant increase since the beginning of the year. Alongside that, in the recent period, the global prices of certain food products have risen. As a result, inflation in many countries has edged up. Core inflation in the external environment of the Polish economy, including the euro area, has also picked up in the recent period. The European Central Bank is keeping interest rates close to zero, including the deposit rate below zero, and reinvests maturing securities bought under the asset purchase program. The US Federal Reserve is keeping interest rates unchanged. At the same time, the Fed is gradually limiting the pace of its balance sheet reduction. In Poland, economic conditions remain good, and annual GDP growth in the first quarter 2019 amounted to 4.7%. Activity growth is driven by rising consumption, albeit at a slightly lower rate than in previous quarters, fueled by increasing employment and wages, as well as very high consumer sentiment. This is accompanied by a marked rise in investment, including a strong recovery in investment outlays of enterprises. In the first quarter of this year, net exports also made a positive contribution to GDP, despite the weakening economic conditions in the external environment of the Polish economy. In recent months, consumer price growth has increased, which was accounted for by rising fuel and food prices, as well as higher core inflation. Nonetheless, inflation continues to run at moderate levels. In the Council's assessment, the outlook for economic conditions in Poland remains favourable, and GDP growth this year may turn out to be slightly higher than expected in the March projection. At the same time, inflation will remain at a moderate level, and in the monetary policy transmission horizon will stay close to the target. The Council judges that the current level of interest rates is conducive to keeping the Polish economy on a sustainable growth path and maintaining macroeconomic stability. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Governor. And questions? Ms. Braniasz, my question is about the dynamics of the GDP growth. For the first quarter, the growth has been much higher than expected, and at the moment, analysts expect it to be 4.5% in terms of growth. What's your expectation when it comes to the current year? Well, I have said that perhaps 2 conferences ago, or maybe more. I personally expect more, and I think this is going to be the case. As for other analytical centers, as usual, they have usually been inclined to agree with the NBP interest rates.
Ladies, good afternoon. Dorota Barcyzel, Bloomberg News. As people are asking about economic growth, you were stating in your statement that GDP growth would be probably higher than what was predicted in March. And naturally, I would like to ask whether inflation is going to be whether this higher economic growth is going to be accompanied by inflation. So will July projection say that? Well, it's very difficult for me to say what's going to happen in the July projection. We will only know it within, in some time, but probably it will be a little bit higher, even though not concerning at all. Still not of concern, but well, I will use the opportunity and ask all of you gentlemen, given the fact that Professor Sura and Professor Gatnar are with us, the latter hasn't been with us for a while during a press conference, so the question is whether the fact that you're here, gentlemen, does that mean that opinions across the MPC have diversified? Opinions on inflation? No. Well, presence at this press conference is simply a matter of availability and time and schedules. And, well, some people, and simply looking who's been there recently and who hasn't. So, the question to both gentlemen, do you also share this opinion that there's no reason for concern when it comes to possible price growth, price increase? Well, Madam, indeed, we will know the content of this projection in a month's time, in July, but from what we already know, we have some short-term data and short-term analysis available, and they all indicate that in the second half of the year, especially towards the end of the year, the inflation might exceed the target and be close to 3%. But, well, we don't know what kind of inflation path is going to be revealed with the July projection. But I would like to point out to three factors. Well, the CPI. So CPI is lower than in the rest of our region, not being in the Eurozone. And that's an interesting characteristic that may be due to the size of our economy, but still we have to see that, like Hungary, Romania, Czech Republic, their inflation is higher. Secondly, if you look at inflation in the service sector, so prices of services, that may be a better indicator or a better reflection of a certain pressure coming up. In April, the projection said 3.5, so maybe CPI is being stifled by some local phenomena, and to me, it is simply my theory that those social transfers that are happening may be stifling demands of higher wages. And thirdly, there is a gap because households with lower income are not really represented in the sample that the Central Statistical Office is using. And from the data that we received yesterday, it seems that inflation, as felt by those households, is 4% higher than households that are more affluent, more wealthy. So 0.4% higher than other households. That's why, well, maybe towards the end of the year, this inflation is going to go up, even though now it seems that it's pretty low. We will see that in the July projection. We are expecting it's going to grow, that is going to be around 3%, and then it will fall. So grow up to around 3%, just, yes, up to around 3% this year still. and then fall. But please wait for the July projection. You are saying 0.4% or 4 basis points, 0.4%. So the way those lower income households are feeling inflation, they feel as if it were 0.4% higher. And actually those households are poorly represented. There is simply a gap in our sample, in our representation. So I would say we need to take that into account as we are wondering why inflation seems higher in Poland than across the region, but everywhere. Inflation is being measured, and inflation affects different social groups differently, because it all depends on our own individual sort of shopping basket. But it depends whether we're buying more bread or more vehicles. Are we buying more luxury goods or other non-processed goods, because then this affects how we perceive inflation. Well, madam, I would like to note that current levels of inflation, as indicated for May and April, are not very surprising, because the March projection had a similar scenario. And also, I don't think that this year inflation should be above the target, like 2.5%. Actually, there is a possible scenario that the inflation might be around 3%. Yes, it is a scenario, but only the beginning of the following year, or sort of end of this year, beginning of next year. But still, it's one of the scenarios, so we don't know whether it's going to materialize. Whether it's going to materialize depends on electricity prices. Let's remember that the November projection assumed a higher inflation this year, but actually towards the end of December the new law appeared that froze energy prices, and then inflation went down compared to the projection, to the then projection. So still, we don't know what the regulator is going to do towards the end of this particular year. And, well, but definitely electricity or energy prices will affect inflation in Q1 next year. Generally, inflation is very low, it will remain low, and we see no reasons for concern, not this year, not next year. Next question. Good afternoon, Rafał Tuszyński, the Polish press agency. I would like to continue along the lines of energy prices. We have heard more details recently. Starting 1st of July, prices for big enterprises are going to be free. Are going to be, well, we're talking about the de minimis assistance, but maybe not all companies are going to receive this kind of assistance, given the fact that the market or the prices are going to follow a free market principles. So what kind of hikes in electricity prices can we expect? The March projection assumed that the market will become completely free and liberated. So, well, we cannot decide what the government might say. So the Council is going to simply adapt. Right, these decisions are the government's decision, and we don't know what they're going to be like. Right, Governor, recently market valuation of our interest rates has just stopped occurring, or the valuation is falling, or even the market might be talking about decreases in interest rates. So what would you say to that, given the fact that our economic situation is very good? Core inflation is growing, and our global environment is more of an enigma. Right. More question marks appear around us, and the situation is pretty uncertain. However, the vector of this uncertainty is pointing towards an economic downturn. So there is a probability that there's going to be a poorer economic environment in Western economies. It's not going to be pro-inflationary. I would say quite the opposite. Central banks who are thinking of hikes last year or more recently, they decided to abandon it. So, like, for example, the Fed are thinking about doing quite the opposite. The ECB, of course, they're not thinking about lowering interest rates. These are impossible to lower further, but they are thinking about some sort of a way to stimulate, to support the economy rather than tighten the monetary policy. So that's our situation. When it comes to Poland, our challenge is all about economic growth, but not inflation. Right now,
and which factors play a major role in the inflation picture, in the inflation growth perspective? What is more important, is that the economic situation in Poland or the global decreasing demand? Throughout Western Europe, we have seen demand and a very new positive element with a wonderful increase in investments in enterprises. We have witnessed an immense growth of investments, and we waited for it for a long time to happen, and it finally happened. So it happened in a situation where there aren't as many reasons for optimism, especially in our surrounding economies, in notably Germany. So there are no elements for concern. The growth has been sustainable, and the rate has been decreasing because it has been decreasing in the surrounding area, but it's still quite good. In the context of investments, the increase in investments observed in the first quarter, does the Monetary Policy Council think it will be continued? And do you think this will lead to a reevaluation of the GDP, or which would reflect a lower pricing pressure in the economy? Well, you can always establish it post factum based on what kind of investments have been made. And do remember that this is related to investments of various big enterprises and also the absorption of EU funding. But Statistics Poland has reported that private enterprises have finally increased investment. Why have they decided to do so? Have they exhausted other opportunities, or, as some have suggested, they are introducing more up-to-date capital possibilities, or will labor be going more expensive in Poland because people are living a better life? So there must be some shift in the economy towards modern technologies, high technologies. It's hard to tell at the moment. We will know afterwards, once we have surveyed the companies. So the investments have emerged. So there is another engine. So it's not just the demand and consumption, but also investments that have been pulling the economy. But of course, consumer optimism in the households has been really high. Personal expectations, family expectations have been positive. And people spend money, they earn ever more money, and they spend more money, and enterprises and also sellers anticipate that this trend will persist. Next question. Yes, hello. Katarzyna Kstowa, Litvianska TVN24. Let me ask you about the nomination for Teresa Czerwińska. Was a consultant, and what kind of responsibilities is she going to have? What's your view of her competences? Well, has been consulted. Well, members of the board usually make a decision once the governor has increased or has proposed that another member of the board should be added, and this is my personal will, and then I direct a proposal to the president, and the president nominates that individual after having a counter-signature from the prime minister. So this is the procedure, but it's me who wants that particular individual at the board or not. And if I do not propose anyone, then neither the prime minister nor the president can do anything like this. So there was an opportunity of another Minister of Finance, highly qualified Minister of Finance. Ms. Czerwińska is a well-known professor. She has collaborated with some MPC members. So with such a highly qualified specialist to be a member of the board, well, and she's also well versed with issues of management, and she has the experience of the Minister of Finance, so we have taken advantage of this. What about her responsibilities? Any member of the board works as a member of the board. The board makes all the important decisions. The governor might stop or suggest that certain decisions are taken, but it's a collective process, and she will be supervising a section of the work of the National Bank of Poland. We have already had some ideas. I have had some ideas, but I am going to talk to her very soon, and I would like to leave that for an official communique that will be published on an MBP website. We have agreed on a certain area, and today I talked to the minister and talked to her about some technical matters of how the bank functions. It's quite different from the Ministry of Finance, and the working conditions here are much better, with a wonderful set of professionals. Well, of course, the Ministry of Finance works equally well, but we have an absolute top of professionals, best database, best working conditions. So everything here is very good, and I hope President Czerwińska will feel good here, and today she will be participating in a meeting of the board of the NBP, and she will be co-deciding on certain decisions. To finish it off, which department are you going to entrust to her? Well, is that a secret? Well, I have made a decision, but of course it would be nice if I notify the head of the department first. That would be kind and with good manners, but of course it will be all transparent. The fact that you didn't find certain things out was due to the existing legislation. Next question, please. Let me go back to the value of money, because, well, Mr. Governor, on the one hand, you have been saying that inflation might rise to 3%, but on the other hand, you have said that inflation has remained low and it will remain low, so 3%. You didn't really quite remember what I said. We have projections, and I said something like, so personally I said that I do not exclude that towards the end of the year or around Christmas or right after Christmas there will be inflation rate that it might approach 3% and then it will drop. Well, yes, and then it will drop, but judging by the projections that we have had, and you said that July production is going to probably show a slightly higher inflation rate, but we do know that according to the March projection it was supposed to be 2.7, and I love projections, but sometimes things get out of my memory. But if it's going to be slightly higher, like you said, well, I just said that it would approach. No, in July projection you said that the inflation would be slightly higher, but I said that inflation is going to rise towards the end of the year or at the beginning of the next year, and then it will decline. So you anticipate, as far as you can anticipate, it's going to be similar. Well, we'll see next time when we meet, but I anticipate that it's going to be slightly higher, but it's still within the inflation target. We have an inflation target of 2.5 with a deviation lower or higher, which is a natural thing. This is natural course of things. A lot depends on the food prices, energy prices, on elements that are beyond our control. Well, for the last months, we actually forgot about real interest rates, haven't we? No, we haven't forgotten about that. We continue to think about that. Well, I assume you haven't, but at the conference, we haven't really mentioned real interest rates for quite some time. But if inflation comes up to 3%, and if it stays at the target, around the target, there is quite a considerable risk that the real interest rate is going to be negative, not just the lowest ever, but also in the longest period of time, under conditions which are radically different from what we saw 2 years ago when we had negative interest rates, because the zloty, as you underlined many times before, was a substitute of tightening monetary policy. Today the situation is slightly different. Are we ready for that? Well, what would happen? Whatever would happen, whatever bad thing would happen by the things that you mentioned, this is not a problem for the economy. The price of loans or lending will continue to be positive at banks. So we have analyzed nominal changes in this respect, and of course we are interested in real changes, but whether or not they are just below zero will not really make too much of a difference that would really harm the economy.
If I may, Mr. Governor, I even talked about it today. We are getting back to this area of negative real interest rates. Of course, real interest rates are negative. For a bit we were not there, but we've gotten back into this area. And well, potentially this may affect savings. So factors that might encourage general public to save are going to disappear. And on the other hand, consumers are encouraged to take out loans. Right. Professor Gartner has always been worried about such events occurring, but actually the board of the National Bank of Poland, well, no, it doesn't mean that. Well, in the stability report, you also stated that debt in households is growing. Well, yes, but it's not an issue, and the financial supervision authority should monitor that, because high-value loans are on the rise. 50 to 100,000 zlotys. Well, are these consumer loans really? What are these? So this is something that might be of concern. And I'm actually mentioning it quite a lot. It has been of concern for you, Professor Gartner. Yes, for me. For myself, as the governor or the rest of the board of the council, it hasn't been an issue of concern. Well, I would like to say a few words about that. We've had already some historical data about that. We already had a period like this with negative real interest rates, and at that time also some people had an opinion that deposits are going to melt down, but actually it never happened. We shouldn't be worried about it. In most European countries the situation is similar, and it doesn't lead to any negative events. Well, there is a propensity right now for consumers to spend a little bit more. Our level of income is quite low. If your income is low, you're not going to save all that much money, so you're spending. And actually, historically speaking, our households have been the most optimistic. They do consume, they do spend, and this is a driver for our economy. Well, I'm not here to try and to enter into a conflict with you, but even if we were in a period of negative interest rates in the past, they were not as negative as they are right now, and no one occurred they would remain negative for as long. Plus, you know, right now interest rates are positive, and we still don't know how long the situation is going to be maintained. These statistical calculations are of no consequence for the economy. I would like to ask this traditional, loans are cheap, money is cheap, but I don't think there is a run and huge demand on loans. That's a natural process. Consumers, businesses, they take as much loan, they take on as much debt as they need. Mostly, enterprises are funded, they fund themselves from their own equity. We encourage banks to lend and we encourage businesses to borrow, but if they have other sources of funding, they can do that. My traditional question is about a perspective of interest rate stability. Given the fact that our global environment is more and more challenging, should we still be asking members of the MPC about a possible hike in interest rates, or should we ask whether these rates are going to stabilize themselves, or should we be asking about a possible decrease in interest rates? I've already told you, when governors of central banks are meeting every 2 months in Basel, during the Bank of International Settlements meeting, we cannot issue any statements after those meetings. Some time ago, there was a climate where one could think of hikes, but still, there's no single governor of a central bank who would worry about that. People are more worried about the economic situation, whether it's going to remain favorable. That's the situation. Those central banks that overdid it when it comes to increases of interest rates and they tightened their monetary policy, now they are backpedaling. We haven't done anything like this, and we're not discussing any hikes in interest rates. There are no grounds for that, nor are there grounds for decreasing interest rates. Current interest rates are historically at low, but they're still positive. On the positive side, given the rest of Europe, we have quite high and positive interest rates. We can still maneuver. There is still room for maneuver if need be in the future. We don't have to resort to unconventional monetary policy methods. We don't have to purchase bonds or anything like that, purchase any such assets, because we still have interest rates to resort to. And half-jokingly, because, well, we cannot be serious about predicting things that are so far into the future. We can only try and predict things that are closer to us in the future. But still, there's nothing to indicate a change of interest rates. It could be that till the end of this term, of this council, interest rates are going to remain unchanged. It might be a little bit frustrating that they remain the same. So many conferences, so many meetings of the MPC, and we're still saying we're keeping them the same. But they are the way they should be. These interest rates are conducive to stability of our economy, and actually all analysts are also assuming that the economy is going to remain pretty stable. I mean, this is what's happening around us. This is our advantage, because we are more predictable this way. So businesses, investors, consumers love stability. Most of all, if people are very young, they like an unexpected challenge. But as human beings, we tend to appreciate stability and predictability. The MPC, the NBP provide this stability for investors to feel safe, for people to borrow money and feel optimistic. We're approaching the end. Final questions, please. So let me ask a technical question. I will go back to the minutes from the March meeting, from the March press conference. There was a sentence saying that the current interest rates are conducive to maintaining stable growth and macroeconomic balance. Also, you added, and maintain a stable financial sector. So this was a phrase that hadn't occurred before or later. So this phrase, why wasn't this phrase repeated in your following statements? What were you trying to say? These interest rates that we have right now are good for stability of the banking sector. So no part of our banking sector is worse off because of those interest rates. Of course, commercial banks, as always, would love to see higher interest rates. Higher interest rates mean for them more possible revenue or profit, so that's obvious. So why this phrase, and stabilize the banking sector, is not repeated in the following statements? Maybe later we discussed a possible decrease or something. Of course, decreasing interest rates is a different story altogether, because in case of some banks, it might lead to all sorts of trouble with profits. But right now, we're not discussing any of this. Those rates that we have right now are very adequate, and it seems that they're going to remain stable. Final question. Well, all uncertain factors may be there, and they are from the outside, like energy prices.
Hello, Professor. And good afternoon, everyone. Radosław Enkiewicz, Polish Press Agency. I have a question about the purchases of gold that you, Professor, mentioned. Are there any other purchases by the bank that have been made? Well, did I say this? Oh, there was a film for International Children's Day with Roxana Węgiel, the singer. Oh, I do remember that, yes. I got that from the communication department. I mentioned that, reiterated that on a number of occasions. Last year we bought 25 tons of gold. The management board adopted a decision that we could have more gold in our reserves, more prorated to our GDP. It's not a necessity, and doesn't really have an impact on anything. So increasing gold reserve might just reinforce the credibility of the central bank. And as you may have noticed, last year and the two preceding years, central banks, almost all central banks across Europe, actually did purchase gold. There were many different purchases and motivated different ways, and we bought 25 tons last year. And, well, this is just a normal course of things, that the structure of our reserves just undergoes changes. This was the case in the past, and this will be the case in the future. Hello. Last question. So, and children and youth are interested in gold because today's money is paper money. It's not exchangeable into precious metals. It's not the kind of money that we used to know, that we could just grab in our hand, and this would be just valuable by the sheer virtue of the metal that it was made of. Whereas gold just continues to be very concrete, tangible value. Why don't you come and visit our money center, and you can always grab and hold the bar of gold and really feel how valuable it is. Arkadiusz Augustyniak, Polish Radio. You, Mr. Governor, said that fuel and food prices cannot really be influenced by the MPC in terms of interest rates, but you do influence what happens with the so-called second round effect. So my question is, MPC members, do you see any risk of the second round effects anywhere at the horizon, or is that a complete science fiction thing? Nothing like this has occurred. Some MPC members actually raised this issue last year and early this year, so there were some concerns about the political cycle, so they were afraid of some pressure and uncontrolled wages, salaries rises that might actually prompt or trigger a kind of spiral, and there might be some kind of cross-fertilization between those factors, but nothing like that happened. Wages and salaries have been really rising quite a lot, perceptible rates in any family, but it has been sustainable. So within the growth rate that we have had, a balance can be reached. Well, nothing is eternal, You cannot be eternally young or happy. So I cannot really tell what will happen sometime in the future, in the next economic cycle. There is, of course, a number of factors of concern, worrying factors in Europe and beyond. The trade war between the US and China is, of course, an important element, which adds anxiety to economic forecasts. Exporters, again, have been faring quite well, and we have been surprised, taken by surprise again and again by them. Given the decline of economic sentiment in Germany, there have been declining orders from the German market to Poland, and Polish exporters have found some other markets to bridge the gap. So then again, they have shown they've shown they are really robust. And compared to Europe and the Western world, wages and salaries in Poland remain low, so our competitiveness remains high. With high work discipline, high efficiency and quality, Polish people are a hard-working nation. Apart from a few other nations, mostly in Asia, we continue to be highly economically active, highly disciplined, working perfectly, well-educated. So the range of needs that have been unrealized over the decades of communism is so immense. So families expect to have a more dignified life, and there have been many needs that remained unsatisfied, including housing needs. So people have a strong stimulus to work, strong incentive to elevate the living standards, ensure education for their children, and this really drives the economy, because very often you ask, what is the source, what's behind this Polish miracle, economic miracle? So I think our growth rate is probably third highest in the world, and this will continue to be under difficult economic conditions. So you can call this a miracle, but any economic student knows that any economic growth is based on human labor and well-educated labor, reasonable labor. So you put your work into areas where this makes sense. So we have reasonable management, and thanks to NBP, we also have financial discipline, stability, stable money, even though it's totally liberated. So this is totally free money with free fluctuation rates, but it's stable nevertheless. So these are quite some achievements that have been admired by the entire world. We have been boring all throughout the conferences, and MPC members, we have nothing to say, no dramatic stories or events to tell. So we always say, the situation in Poland has been very good, and this is the story, and let's let the moment persist, as the poet says. And finally, the society has also reached a level of calm and optimism based on observations of things that have been going on. So this is going to stay for a number of years. Whereas in Germany, the economic sentiment has improved. It's not really very impressive. It's still below 1%. The growth out there, but it's still quite encouraging, and we would like Germany to really push forward with economic growth, and then we can fuel the growth further, and our bank will take care of that. And we have nothing negative to say about the Ministry of Finance or the government, but we also would like to make sure that the growth is not too fast, that it remains balanced, because it's easy to really get accelerated and then kind of rush like they did in Romania, and this leads to certain imbalances or deformed economic proportions. So this has not been happening in Poland, and I'm not talking about official optimism. I'm talking as a professor. I'm the governor, so of course I need to follow the line of the NVP, and my colleagues are professors. So they have constitutional mandates, so they are fully independent. So any of them can actually demonstrate their opinions, no matter if the board of the NBP likes it or not. I have no say here. So any member of the board will actually need a permission for me to speak in public. And that's why we have the MPC. Like you sometimes say, why would we have a monetary policy council? Just because we have independent authorities, figures of authority from the academia, and they might differ in their opinions. So we all know that Poland's economic situation has been immensely favorable, and we pray in our souls so that it all stays unchanged. Thank you very much for the meeting, for the questions, for the conference, and see you next time.